Hello and welcome to Ewe Sew You. My name's Zoe and this is my channel all about the crafty bits and pieces I get up to. I knit, I sew, I spin on a drop spindle, I dabble on weaving from time to time and anything else that takes my crafty fancy. But today we are binding some seams, so grab a brew, put your feet up and let's get started. Welcome back to any returning viewers, and to any new viewers a very warm welcome to you. As I mentioned at the opening to this video, today we're looking at binding some seams. Now I recently finished the Truffle Coat by Lara. Now the pattern is written to fully line the coat, but because I was using a fleece backed soft shell I opted not to include the lining. So I needed to get a clean finish on my seams in another way, and I opted to use bias tape. So I'm going to show you how I went about doing that. And yeah, enjoy. Okay, so I'm working on the sleeve for the Truffle Coat. It's a two-piece sleeve, so I've got my front piece and my back piece. And it's a fleece-backed soft shell, so it's not a fabric that I'm going to be pressing. It's also a fairly bulky fabric, so I'm not going to be doing a French seam on this. This sleeve structure would work with a French seam down here in a lighter weight fabric. But if you're doing a lighter weight coat, you may well be lining it anyway, and the pattern is drafted with a lining. I've just omitted the lining piece. So I'm not going to be lining it, I'm not going to be French seaming it. What I am going to do is I'm going to put the two bits of fabric right side together and seaming as per the instructions. The instructions then ask you to top stitch this seam down, which I will be doing, but I'm adding a step in between to give a nice neater finish to the seams, which I'm doing on pretty much all the seams as far as my bias tape will go. And I'm just binding all of the seams just to give it that neater finish because I'm not lining it. So I'm going to get these clipped together with this fabric. I'm not pinning it, I'm using these little clips instead. So I'm going to get this seam sewn and then I will show you how I'm putting the binding on and we'll get that bit done. Okay, so I've stitched that seam line. Obviously, as I say, I've not pressed it because I can't really press this fabric. And I've neatened up the edges. I haven't worried about trimming it down too far for bulk because I didn't want to. You can do, absolutely, if you wish to. With this one, because I'm going to be top stitching the seam down and it's a sleeve seam, it's going to be quite it's not going to be particularly noticeable in this particular fabric, but with where it's placed, the bulk's not going to cause me too many issues, so I'm just going to leave the seam as is. And I'm using this double folded bias tape, so I'm going to essentially attach the bias tape on one side and then turn it over. So I am going to be folding along the crease, stitching along the crease to hold the tape in place inside that seam allowance. I'm not overly fussed about where it is. It's usually I stitch it quite close to the stitch line that's there. If you've narrowed your seam allowance, don't go beyond the stitch line. Because you don't want to be putting another seam in, so you want to stay within the seam allowance for your stitching. And as long as your bias tape is wide enough, you're not going to need to trim down the seam allowance too far. I haven't trimmed it down on any of the others because it's a coat, so it's quite a loose fit, and again the bulk isn't going to cause me too many issues. If it was a tighter fitting garment, then yeah, I would absolutely be cutting down the seam allowance. You can even grade it if you wish to as well. Personal choice there. Okay, so let's get cracking with this. I'm not going to worry too much about clipping it or pinning it on. I'm just going to hold that first bit of the bias tape in place, pop it under the foot. I'm actually running the raw edge of my bias tape along the edge of the raw edges of the seam. And that's going to keep me well inside my seam allowance, which is a good thing. I'm going to back tack at the front and the end and just stitch it all the way down. Okay, so now I've attached the bias tape all the way down to the end of the sleeve. I'm just going to cut that tape off about the same length as the sleeve. Doesn't matter if it's slightly more because I'm going to be hemming the sleeve later anyway. So move the tape out of the way until I need it for the other sleeve. And the next step is to fold the bias tape over the edge of that seam allowance, and I'm going to clip it down in place just to hold it as I go, and clip it all the way down. I'm going to put the clips on the other way around so that the top bit is pointing away from where I've stitched. And the reason for that will become clear in just a moment. Okay, so we're all clipped on, and I'm going to put the sleeve back into the sewing machine this way round. So the fabric is towards the body of the machine and not on the outside of the needle like I normally would do. Again, we want to make sure we're stitching inside the seam allowance, but you want to go fairly close to the edge of the bias tape to keep it in place. Just make sure you are inside the seam allowance. Again, we're going to stitch all the way around. So keeping an eye on that bias tape as it comes around the curve of the seam at the top of the sleeve. Okay, now that I've got my bias tape sewn on, it's not my finest bit of sewing, but it is inside the sleeve, so it's not going to show on the outside. I'm just going to open up the sleeve and identify which side is the back and the front. And then I'm going to top stitch the seam down. It is naturally wanting to bend to this side, but I'm thinking I probably want to stitch it that way around. So that's the front, and that's, yeah, so I'm going to top stitch it down towards the back. Backs of sleeves generally have 2 notches, fronts of sleeves generally have 1. So I'm going to hold my seam to the back, and I'm actually going to be able to feel where the edge of the seam is through the fabric. So the bulk actually going to help you here. Okay, so the last step of this particular seam, I've opened the sleeve up now that the bias tape is sewn on, and I'm holding the seam allowance towards the back of the sleeve. I'm just going to top stitch down the edge of that seam allowance. I can actually feel the bulk through the fabric, so I'm going to use the feel of it as my guideline to sew it down. I'm going to go quite slow to keep the accuracy there. Okay, and there we have our seam finished for the sleeve. So curving around for the shoulder at the top, and that'll sit nice and neatly on the arm, and I'm not going to catch anything underneath. Obviously you're going to have a neater finish on the inside if you're using a thread that matches the interior of your coat, but because of the zebra stripes in this fabric I'm using black. I'm not too worried about all the lines we're showing on the inside of the sleeve, because who's going to see it? I'm also not going to be top stitching down the other seams. I may change my mind and top stitch down the raglans, but at the moment I'm not planning on top stitching down any of the other seams. So yes, that's one sleeve done. Got the other one to do, and get cracking with this coat. So I hope you found that useful and interesting. I aim to put a video out every weekend, so like and subscribe and ding that bell for notifications if you've enjoyed spending time in my company. Once a month it's a roundup of the things that I've been working on the previous month, and other times it's videos more like this where I'm showing you how I've gone about working a particular technique or a particular project. And I'd love to see you in the next video. So until then, happy crafting and bye bye for now.